The morning started like any other at the small airport. Sunlight spilled across the tarmac, glinting off the metal bodies of airplanes lined up, ready for their journeys. People hurried through the terminals, dragging bags, checking tickets, and saying hurried goodbyes to loved ones. Among them, a young woman moved with calm determination, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. She carried no luggage, only a small backpack with essentials and a notebook she had brought along out of habit. There was something about her presence that seemed to catch a few curious glances, though she did not notice. She had an air of quiet confidence, a calm that stood out amid the usual airport chaos. She reached the gate for the mid-morning flight. It was an ordinary commercial plane. Nothing extraordinary at first glance, but it held more significance to her than any luxury flight might. She watched the ground crew working, the mechanics inspecting the engines, the flight attendants boarding, greeting passengers with smiles and practiced cheerfulness. She had always loved airplanes, not just for their engineering, but for what they represented: freedom, adventure, and the thrill of taking to the skies. Even though she had never flown one herself, her fascination was deep-rooted. She could sit for hours imagining the controls, the instruments, and the feeling of the clouds brushing past at high altitudes. Passengers began filing in, and she found her seat by the window. The cabin hummed with the gentle noise of conversation, seatbelts clicking into place and the whir of the air conditioning. A child in the row ahead pressed his face against the glass, giggling as he pointed at the tarmac below. Couples whispered to each other, reading over their itineraries, and solo travelers adjusted their headphones or opened books. The young woman glanced around at all the ordinary faces, each carrying their own stories and destinations. She felt a sense of connection, the invisible thread that tied strangers together for a few hours in a shared journey. The flight attendants performed their safety demonstrations, and the young woman watched carefully. She absorbed every word and motion not out of necessity but from fascination. She noticed how the attendants moved smoothly through the aisles, checking overhead compartments, offering calm reassurances to nervous travelers. She noticed the slight smile of the lead attendant, the patient nods, the gentle way she guided a passenger whose bag was too large for the overhead bin. Every detail mattered to her, every action a small piece of the greater puzzle of flying. The captain's voice came over the intercom. He was a man with years of experience, his voice steady and professional. He welcomed passengers and outlined the flight path. There was a sense of authority in his tone, the kind that made people feel safe. She listened carefully, noting the calm confidence behind his words. She had heard pilots speak before, studied videos and interviews, and always admired their ability to maintain composure under pressure. Today she would watch one in action firsthand. She felt a mix of anticipation and quiet excitement, though she had no idea how drastically her day would change. The plane began to taxi, moving slowly along the runway. Engines rumbled beneath the wings, a deep vibrating sound that resonated through the cabin. Passengers adjusted in their seats, some gripping armrests a little tighter, others leaning back with a sense of ease. The young woman pressed her hand lightly against the window, feeling the vibration, imagining how it must feel from the cockpit. She thought about the intricate systems that kept the plane aloft, the countless people whose work ensured each journey was safe. Her mind wandered briefly to her father, who had flown small planes years ago. He had taught her a few basics when she was a child, gestures and explanations that seemed magical at the time. She had never forgotten them, though she had never flown herself. Takeoff was smooth, the plane lifting gently from the tarmac. The city below shrank, the streets and buildings becoming miniature versions of themselves. Passengers pressed against windows, pointing out landmarks or marveling at the scenery. The young woman felt the rush of air and the slight tilt of the plane, a sensation both thrilling and grounding. She took a deep breath, allowing herself to settle into the rhythm of flight. Her heart was calm, but her mind was alive with observation, noting every movement of the wings, every sound from the engines, every flicker of lights on the control panels she could see through the cockpit glass. Conversations continued around her, ordinary chatter about vacation plans, business trips, or family visits. She listened without truly hearing, lost in her own thoughts. She imagined the pilot in the cockpit, hands steady on the controls, eyes scanning instruments with practiced precision. She imagined the layers of decisions being made every second, from altitude adjustments to navigation. The plane was more than metal and engines. It was a symphony of precision, and today she was a silent observer, feeling the rhythm without touching the instruments. Hours seemed to pass in minutes as the plane leveled out at cruising altitude. The hum of the engines became a comforting background noise. Passengers settled into their routines, reading, sleeping, or watching movies. The young woman continued to study the cockpit, peeking through the small glass window as the pilot and co-pilot communicated quietly, making adjustments. She noticed how they worked together, a silent partnership built on trust and experience. There was a grace to it, a confidence she admired. She felt a flutter of longing, a desire to understand it fully, to feel that level of command and composure. As the flight continued, she watched the clouds drift past, shapes forming and dissolving in an endless dance. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the cabin in warm golden light. She felt a sense of peace, a rare moment of clarity in the ordinary chaos of life. She imagined herself in the cockpit, hands on the controls, guided by intuition and knowledge. It was a comforting fantasy, one she never believed could become reality. And yet there was a quiet whisper inside her mind, a voice suggesting that sometimes extraordinary things could happen when least expected. The passengers remained largely unaware of the minor mechanical hums and soft clicks that the plane made as it adjusted to turbulence. For most, it was a normal part of flying, nothing to worry about. The young woman, however, noticed subtle signs, small shifts in the instruments, slight hesitations in the pilot's movements. She did not panic. She simply observed, cataloging everything in her mind. It was a skill she had developed over years of curiosity and attention, the ability to see details others might miss. Meals were served, drinks handed out, and announcements made. The young woman sipped water, but her attention never wavered. She watched the cabin crew, noting how they maintained calm despite minor inconveniences or passengers' complaints. She watched the pilot and co-pilot, noting how they adjusted their grip on the controls, how their eyes flicked to the instruments and back to the horizon. She absorbed it all quietly, silently preparing for a day she could never have predicted would become extraordinary. Time moved forward, the plane cruising steadily. Passengers began to relax, conversations softening, children falling asleep and books closing. The young woman felt a strange anticipation, a sense that something was about to shift. It was not fear, but a quiet awareness that the ordinary flight she had boarded might not remain ordinary for long. She looked out the window at the endless sky, the sun now climbing higher, casting shadows across the landscape far below. She felt both excitement and calm, a strange mixture that seemed to steady her heart. Everything seemed normal, but in the next moments the ordinary would end. What had begun as a routine flight would soon demand courage, quick thinking, and action no one expected. The young woman, quiet and observant, sat by the window, unaware that her life and the lives of everyone on board was about to change in ways that would test the limits of human capability. She would soon discover that sometimes calm observation and careful attention could become the foundation for extraordinary heroism, and that even someone without formal experience could rise to the occasion when circumstances demanded it. The stage was set, the characters in place, and the ordinary flight was poised to become an unforgettable story of courage, determination, and the impossible. The flight had been smooth for the first hour, but without warning, everything changed. A sudden shudder ran through the plane, making the passengers grip their armrests tightly. The young woman's eyes widened, and she instinctively leaned forward to observe the cockpit. The hum of the engines was no longer steady. It was uneven, like a heart skipping beats. Passengers murmured, some laughing nervously, thinking it was just turbulence, but the young woman knew something was wrong. She could see the slight tension in the pilot's shoulders, the quick glances between him and the co-pilot. Something in the air had shifted, and it demanded attention. The plane tilted slightly, and an alarm rang out, shrill and urgent. Lights flashed across the cockpit, a warning system she had only read about in manuals and seen in documentaries. The pilot spoke into the radio, his voice controlled but tight, issuing quick commands and listening intently to responses. The co-pilot's hands moved quickly over the instruments, flipping switches and adjusting dials. The cabin filled with a low vibration that made the floor hum under passengers' feet and seats. A few people began to panic, clutching each other, whispering prayers or crying quietly. The young woman's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had to understand what was happening. Through the small window into the cockpit, she could see the pilot's face, Lines of worry creased his forehead, and beads of sweat formed despite the air conditioning. He tried to maintain control, but there were signs of struggle in his movements. The co-pilot mirrored his efforts, but the plane continued to shudder, losing a few hundred feet of altitude with each passing second. She noticed the way the instruments blinked, some showing warnings she recognized from her limited knowledge. She realized the situation was more serious than any normal turbulence. The engines were failing. Passengers began to notice the severity of the situation. A mother hugged her child tightly, whispering reassurances that she didn't fully believe herself. A man in the row ahead clutched a briefcase, knuckles white, his face pale. People's voices rose in panic, some shouting questions to flight attendants who rushed up and down the aisles trying to calm everyone. The young woman stayed in her seat for a moment, analyzing the situation. She realized that if no one acted decisively, this could end in disaster. Her mind raced through every memory she had of her father explaining plane mechanics, cockpit controls, and emergency procedures. Years of observation suddenly became vital knowledge. The pilot's voice over the intercom was tense but firm. He explained to the passengers that there was a mechanical issue and that they needed to remain calm. The young woman noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted the controls. Something inside her shifted. She could no longer sit back as a mere observer. She knew the pilot was struggling, and if he couldn't regain control, lives were at stake. She stood up, moving quickly but deliberately toward the cockpit. Passengers stared, some incredulous, some hopeful, as she approached the front. The door to the cockpit opened and she stepped inside. The pilot looked at her, exhaustion and panic in his eyes, as if silently pleading for help he didn't know he could ask for. The co-pilot barely acknowledged her, too focused on the rapidly fluctuating instruments. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had never piloted a plane, but she remembered everything her father had shown her. She recalled emergency procedures, control functions, and the way instruments interacted. Her hands hovered over the controls, learning their weight, their sensitivity. She was calm, but her mind was sharp, analyzing every detail, every possible reaction. The alarms continued to blare, the plane losing altitude, and the air traffic control communication crackled through the speakers. They asked for status updates, guidance, and reassurance. The young woman answered as best as she could, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. She could feel the plane responding, the subtle shift when she adjusted the throttle, the slight tilt when she moved the yoke. It was a dance of life and death, and she had been thrust into the lead role without warning. Back in the cabin, passengers could see the seriousness of the situation reflected in the faces of the flight attendants. They moved quickly, instructing people to secure their seatbelts, to brace for impact, and to remain calm. A sense of tension filled the air, punctuated by muffled sobs and whispered prayers. The young woman in the cockpit felt every second as if it were a minute, every movement critical. She had to stabilize the plane before it was too late. Her heart pounded, but her mind remained laser-focused, recalling instructions, piecing together patterns from her observations, and relying on instinct honed over years of fascination. The pilot, exhausted and sweating, tried again to correct the course, but the plane wobbled unpredictably. She realized he could not do it alone. She had to take control. Her hands moved with purpose, gripping the controls and making small, calculated adjustments. She kept her eyes on the instruments, scanning constantly for feedback. Air traffic control guided her, giving instructions with precise clarity, and she followed, her mind absorbing and executing without hesitation. The plane's movements began to stabilize slowly but noticeably. There were small shifts, slight improvements, and she felt a surge of hope. Passengers began to sense the change, a subtle easing of tension as the plane stopped losing altitude as rapidly. The young woman's voice continued to guide the cockpit, calm and precise. The pilot looked at her, a mixture of relief and disbelief on his face. The co-pilot finally acknowledged her presence, nodding in cautious approval, and continued assisting where he could. The plane, once wild and uncontrollable, was responding, guided by her hands and mind. Every correction mattered. Every decision could mean life or death. The turbulence continued, clouds buffeting the plane, but she adjusted with small, calculated movements. She monitored the engines, instruments, and horizon, keeping everything balanced. Passengers were still nervous, but the flight attendants' calm reassurances helped them remain seated. Some passengers noticed the young woman in the cockpit, recognizing her as the reason the plane seemed to regain stability. A few whispered to each other, amazed at her courage, while others silently prayed for their safety. Minutes stretched endlessly, each one a battle of nerves and skill. She guided the plane, correcting small deviations, compensating for engine inconsistencies, and following air traffic control instructions. Her mind was fully engaged, every detail observed and adjusted in real time. The young woman was no longer just a passenger. She was the heart of the plane's survival, the one keeping hope alive when the situation had seemed impossible. Eventually, the plane began to respond more predictably, its movement smoother, its altitude stabilizing. The alarms still sounded occasionally, but each one was met with calm corrections. The passengers' anxiety began to ease slightly, though the tension remained thick in the cabin. They trusted, without fully understanding why, that someone was taking control. The young woman continued her careful adjustments, hands steady, mind unwavering. She could not falter now. Lives depended on her focus and courage. As the young woman guided the plane through the turbulence, she thought of the people on board, each with their own stories and dreams. She thought of the families waiting at their destinations, the loved ones hoping for safe arrivals. She felt a deep sense of responsibility, a weight on her shoulders, but also a quiet determination. She would not let fear dictate the outcome. She would use every bit of knowledge and instinct she had to bring them safely through this crisis. The impossible seemed daunting, but she knew it could be done. She had to believe it. With each passing moment, the plane became steadier, the shudders less severe. The young woman adjusted her grip, fine-tuned the throttle, and made subtle corrections that gradually brought the situation under control. The cockpit, once chaotic and tense, began to feel like a place of calculated action, a space where determination and skill met necessity. The pilot leaned back slightly, taking a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, while the co-pilot nodded in acknowledgement. They were witnessing something extraordinary, a passenger untrained guiding a plane through near disaster. Though the danger was far from over, the first step had been taken. She had taken control when it mattered most, stabilizing the plane enough to prevent immediate catastrophe. The passengers, though unaware of the specifics, could feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a tentative hope that survival was possible. The young woman remained in the cockpit, eyes sharp, mind focused, ready for whatever came next. She understood that the hardest challenges were still ahead, but for now, she had done the unimaginable. She had taken the first crucial step toward keeping everyone alive and steering them through a storm they never expected. The plane had stabilized slightly, but the situation was far from safe. The young woman's hands gripped the controls tightly, her mind racing as she worked to keep the plane steady. The hum of the engines was still uneven, and small alarms continued to flash, reminding her that danger was still very real. The pilot, exhausted, leaned against the side, barely able to speak, while the co-pilot stayed close, assisting where possible. The cockpit was tense, every second filled with critical decisions. She looked at the instruments, analyzing each reading carefully. She remembered her father's lessons, recalling how he explained the importance of monitoring altitude, engine power, and airspeed. Every adjustment she made had to be precise. One wrong move could send the plane into a rapid descent. Her heart beat fast, but her mind remained clear. She repeated instructions she had memorized, silently running through steps to keep the plane airborne. Through the cockpit window, she could see the clouds shifting rapidly, the sunlight breaking through in patches. The turbulence continued to rock the plane, shaking passengers in their seats. She could hear the muffled voices of people in the cabin, some praying, some whispering encouragements to each other. A young child clutched a stuffed animal, eyes wide with fear. She felt a surge of responsibility, realizing that the lives of everyone on board depended on her focus and skill. She could not fail. Air traffic control was frantic, issuing rapid instructions and asking for status updates. She responded using a calm tone. She did not entirely feel. Her hands moved almost instinctively, adjusting the throttle, turning the yoke, and watching the instruments respond. Small improvements began to appear. The plane leveled slightly, the tremors less violent. The pilot's eyes met hers, a mix of gratitude and disbelief, silently acknowledging the impossible task she had undertaken. The co-pilot nodded, offering guidance where he could, recognizing her focus and determination. She remembered her father explaining how to manage engine failures, and she applied that knowledge. She monitored which engines were struggling, and adjusted power to compensate. The plane responded to her careful corrections, and she felt a small but crucial sense of control. Each movement required concentration, patience, and intuition. She had never imagined she would be using this knowledge in such a critical moment, but it was the only thing keeping the plane from spiraling into chaos. Passengers began to sense a subtle change. The violent shaking had lessened, though anxiety was still high. Flight attendants moved through the cabin offering reassurance, helping passengers brace themselves and keeping everyone informed. The young woman's mind was entirely on the cockpit, but she could hear snippets of conversations. People were beginning to hope that survival was possible. She drew strength from their silent trust, letting it fuel her determination. Minutes felt like hours as she guided the plane through the turbulent skies. She adjusted the flaps, kept a careful watch on airspeed, and made incremental corrections that gradually stabilized the aircraft. She spoke to air traffic control, repeating their instructions and updating them on the plane's status. Her voice was calm, professional, and authoritative, a stark contrast to the fear and chaos surrounding her. She realized that her composure was as important as her technical actions. The passengers' safety depended on both. She could see the pilot's struggle. His hands trembled and sweat dripped from his brow. He had done everything possible, but his body and mind were failing under the strain. She understood now that she had to take the lead fully. Her focus intensified. Every decision critical, every correction a matter of life or death. The plane's engines groaned, the vibrations echoing through the cockpit, but she remained steady. Her hands moved confidently over the controls, her eyes scanning the instruments for any sign of worsening conditions. She thought of the passengers again, imagining their families waiting at their destinations. She thought of the young child holding a stuffed toy, the elderly woman clutching her hands together in silent prayer, and the man who had been gripping his briefcase tightly in the aisle. Each of them became a reason to push forward, to maintain focus, and to ensure that the plane remained stable. She felt the weight of responsibility, but it did not crush her. It sharpened her resolve. Communication with air traffic control continued. They provided detailed instructions for a safe landing, but it was clear the plane could not reach the nearest airport without careful maneuvering. She listened intently, following their guidance, and made minor adjustments to avoid further stress on the failing engines. Each adjustment brought small improvements. She began to see that what had seemed impossible might just be achievable. The turbulence persisted, but the plane was no longer at the mercy of uncontrolled forces. It was responding to her actions, even if slowly and unevenly. She made a series of subtle corrections, balancing the plane and maintaining altitude. Sweat ran down her face and her arms ached from the constant tension, but she remained focused. Every instrument, every dial, every lever was under her careful attention. She could feel the plane responding to her decisions, a delicate dance that required precision, intuition, and courage. The pilot leaned back slightly, exhausted, letting her take the lead completely. The co-pilot stayed at her side, providing input when necessary, but the young woman was now the one guiding the aircraft. Her confidence grew with each successful adjustment, though she remained cautious. She knew one mistake could undo all the progress she had made. Her focus was absolute, and her actions became almost instinctive, informed by observation, memory, and an unwavering desire to keep everyone alive. She glanced back at the cabin briefly, seeing the passengers' expressions. They were tense, frightened, but some faces reflected a hint of hope. She felt a quiet determination swell within her. This was no longer just about her fascination with planes or her curiosity. This was about life and death. She could not let fear dominate. She had to act, think, and react quickly and correctly. As the minutes dragged on, she continued to stabilize the plane, slowly gaining ground against the chaos. Each movement of the controls, each adjustment of the throttle brought the plane closer to a level flight path. She spoke calmly to air traffic control, updating them on her actions and listening to their guidance. Her instructions were precise, deliberate, and efficient. She had become the central force keeping the aircraft from disaster. Passengers remained unaware of the full extent of her actions, but they could feel the subtle change in the plane's behavior. The violent shaking lessened, and the plane began to glide more smoothly through the air. Flight attendants continued their work, guiding passengers and maintaining calm, their confidence bolstered by the stabilization. The young woman's determination was the hidden force driving this gradual recovery. Ever wavered, her mind sharp despite exhaustion creeping in. The plane was still fragile, still vulnerable, but it was no longer spiraling uncontrollably. She had achieved the first real victory in what had seemed an impossible situation. The pilot and co-pilot looked at her with awe, realizing that she had not only stabilized the aircraft, but had done so under extreme pressure and without formal training. As she guided the plane, she thought about what was ahead. A safe landing was still uncertain, and the next steps would demand even greater skill and courage. She felt a deep connection to every person on board, their lives intertwined with her actions. Her determination did not waver. She would see this through no matter the difficulty. The impossible had been reached once, and she would do it again to ensure survival. The plane, once in chaos, now followed her lead, a testament to focus, courage, and the human capacity to rise above fear when circumstances demanded it. The young woman's hands remained firmly on the controls, her eyes scanning the instruments as the plane moved through uneven skies. The turbulence had not disappeared, but she had learned to anticipate each jolt, each subtle shift in the aircraft's balance. She could feel the plane's weight and power responding to her adjustments, a delicate conversation between human intuition and metal machinery. Every decision she made now was critical. Even small errors could cause the plane to tilt dangerously or lose precious altitude. The pilot, recovering slightly from his exhaustion, watched her with a mixture of relief and disbelief. He had done everything he could, yet he could not achieve the stability she now provided. The co-pilot remained close, offering verbal support, confirming her calculations and assisting in minor corrections. But the young woman was clearly in command. She could feel it, the responsibility settling over her like a heavy cloak, but it strengthened her rather than weakened her. She had never imagined that her fascination with flying could become a matter of life and death. Passengers in the cabin were tense, gripping their armrests, praying silently, or watching the flight attendants with wide eyes. The atmosphere was thick with fear, but there was also a faint glimmer of hope. They could sense a change, even if they could not see her, as the violent jolts of the plane decreased and the ride grew marginally smoother. Flight attendants moved efficiently, reassuring passengers and providing instructions, their own confidence buoyed by the subtle improvement in the plane's behavior. Her mind worked methodically. She monitored the engines, adjusting power to compensate for inconsistencies. She used her memory of her father's lessons to manage airflow and altitude, making minor corrections that had a significant effect on stability. Each movement of the yoke, each adjustment of the throttle was calculated and precise. Sweat ran down her forehead, arms ached, but her focus never wavered. This was no longer a test of curiosity. It was a test of courage, skill, and determination. Communication with air traffic control was ongoing and urgent. Controllers gave instructions quickly, and she repeated them calmly, following each step without hesitation. Her voice remained steady, almost unnervingly so, as she coordinated the flight with the experts guiding her from the ground. They were astonished, watching an untrained civilian take command of a plane that had been moments from chaos. She absorbed their guidance and translated it into action immediately, balancing their advice with her instincts and observations. Every decision brought the plane closer to safety. She could see the horizon through the cockpit window, a patchwork of clouds and sun, and she used it to maintain the plane's orientation. The altimeter and other instruments were her constant companions, each flicker and needle shift a vital piece of information. She made subtle turns, adjusted thrust, and maintained a careful watch on the plane's responses. Each successful correction brought a small surge of confidence, yet she knew she could not relax. The plane was still fragile, and one misstep could undo everything. Hours of intense concentration passed like minutes. She adjusted, observed, and corrected constantly. Her focus in, the passengers began to notice that the worst of the turbulence had lessened. A mother gently comforted her child who had been crying, and an older man exhaled slowly, as if realizing that survival might actually be possible. The young woman's actions were invisible to them, but the effects were tangible. She felt a deep responsibility, not just for herself but for every person on board. Her attention was divided between the plane's systems, the external conditions, and the human lives that depended on her. It was exhausting both mentally and physically, but she refused to falter. The pilot, now more alert, began to assist where possible, giving her verbal cues and taking over minor adjustments when she requested. The co-pilot continued to support her, helping to monitor systems and relay information from air traffic control. Together, they formed an unlikely team, a mixture of trained professionals and an untrained yet determined passenger, all united by the need to survive. The young woman had become the anchor, the steady hand keeping the plane from tipping into disaster. As minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the plane began to respond more predictably. She made small adjustments to throttle and flaps, keeping altitude stable and managing airspeed. The once threatening vibrations and sudden drops became minor fluctuations, easier to compensate for. Her focus was absolute, every muscle and thought dedicated to maintaining control. Sweat soaked her clothes and her muscles screamed with fatigue, but she did not let it interfere. The stakes were too high, and the lives of dozens of people depended entirely on her. Through the cockpit window, she could see patches of clear sky ahead. It was a small but significant sign, a glimmer of hope in a situation that had seemed hopeless. She adjusted the plane's angle carefully, keeping the engines from overloading, and began to plan a route toward a safe landing. Air traffic control continued to provide guidance, and she followed each instruction meticulously. Her hands moved with precision, her mind a whirlwind of calculations, instincts, and memories of lessons learned years ago. Passengers, now noticing the plane's steadier flight, began to whisper quietly among themselves. Fear remained, but it was mingled with cautious relief. Flight attendants smiled subtly, reassured by the stabilization, and continued to provide support. The young woman's courage, focus, and skill were the unseen forces shaping the atmosphere in the cabin, keeping panic at bay and hope alive. She considered the landing ahead. She knew it would be the most challenging part of all. The plane was still not fully stable, the engine still faltering, and the runway distance uncertain. She studied the instruments, planning the approach, calculating the necessary maneuvers, and mentally rehearsing the sequence of actions that would bring everyone down safely. She spoke to air traffic control, confirming the runway and receiving guidance, and translated their instructions into precise adjustments. Every movement of the yoke, every nudge of the throttle, was deliberate and crucial. The pilot and co-pilot watched her closely, offering advice and assistance, but recognizing that she was the central force keeping the plane under control. Her confidence grew with each successful maneuver, though she remained humble and cautious. She understood that overconfidence could be fatal. The plane was still in a precarious state, and her vigilance had to remain absolute. As she guided the plane through the skies, she felt a strange sense of calm amid the chaos. Her focus had sharpened, her instincts were in sync with the aircraft, and her determination had become unshakable. She drew strength from the people on board, imagining each life, each story, each hope that she was protecting. It was more than duty. It was an instinctive drive to preserve life and achieve what seemed impossible. The plane's movements became smoother, and the violent jolts were now brief and manageable. She had managed to create a fragile equilibrium, a state where survival was possible but not guaranteed. Her hands remained on the controls, her eyes scanning instruments and sky alike, adjusting constantly. Each decision was a calculated risk, and each successful adjustment brought a sense of accomplishment and relief. She could see the horizon ahead, the airport in the distance, and she knew that the next challenge would test every skill she had and every ounce of courage. Passengers were beginning to hope. The young woman's unseen guidance had made a tangible difference. Flight attendants whispered reassurances, some glancing toward the cockpit with gratitude and awe. The pilot, still recovering from exhaustion, nodded at her, silently conveying trust and admiration. The co-pilot continued to provide technical support, but she had become the central figure, the person who had taken control when the impossible seemed unavoidable. She continued to adjust, monitor and plan, maintaining the plane's fragile stability. Every second was critical, every movement mattered. She could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her, but it did not hinder her. It focused her mind and sharpened her resolve. She had stabilized the aircraft against incredible odds and had begun to chart a course towards safety. The impossible was no longer an abstract concept. It was unfolding beneath her hands, with each adjustment bringing them closer to survival. The runway appeared in the distance, a strip of concrete and tarmac that represented safety and survival. The young woman focused intently, adjusting the plane's angle and managing engine power as the aircraft descended. The turbulence had lessened, but the plane still required careful guidance. Her hands moved steadily, her mind racing with calculations and instincts honed by observation and years of curiosity. Every second mattered. Air traffic control guided her with calm urgency, giving precise instructions for landing. She repeated each instruction aloud, confirming that she understood and was executing correctly. The plane responded to her careful adjustments, gradually aligning with the runway. The co-pilot monitored the engines and instruments, providing technical input, while the pilot, now recovering, offered encouragement and advice. She had become the central figure in this life-or-death operation, and her focus never wavered. In the cabin, passengers were tense but beginning to sense that hope was within reach. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering quiet reassurances, helping passengers sit upright and brace for landing. There were whispered prayers, silent hugs, and nervous glances toward the cockpit. The young woman's calm and deliberate actions were keeping them alive, even though they could not see her, and they were beginning to trust that they might survive this ordeal. The young woman calculated the plane's descent carefully, making minor corrections to throttle, yoke, and flaps. She monitored airspeed and altitude, keeping a delicate balance to prevent the plane from stalling or nosediving. Sweat ran down her face, her muscles ached, and fatigue threatened to overtake her, but she pushed forward. She drew on every memory of her father's explanations, every observation of pilots, and every instinct she had developed over years of fascination with flying. Each adjustment brought the plane closer to a safe landing. The pilot and co-pilot continued to assist, but it was clear that she was in command. The pilot's expression was one of awe and gratitude. He had never expected a passenger, untrained and inexperienced, to manage the plane under such conditions. Yet here she was, guiding the aircraft with precision, composure, and courage. The co-pilot offered technical support and validation, helping her navigate the final approach. But the central responsibility rested entirely on her shoulders. The plane approached the runway, the final stretch of the journey. The young woman adjusted the flaps and throttle, keeping the landing gear steady and ensuring the plane remained level. Air traffic control instructed her on the exact approach angle and speed, and she executed each step with exacting precision. The runway seemed both distant and immediate, a narrow path to safety that required every ounce of concentration. Passengers braced themselves, holding hands, clutching seatbacks, or closing their eyes. The cabin was tense with anticipation, the fear palpable, but there was also a growing sense of hope. They felt the plane responding to unseen hands, a steadying force that they could not see but could trust. Flight attendants quietly encouraged passengers, their calm demeanor reflecting the gradual stabilization of the plane. The young woman felt the pressure mounting as the plane neared the runway. She adjusted the throttle to maintain a slow, controlled descent, keeping the nose of the plane level. She monitored engine output carefully, ensuring that neither engine was overworked while also adjusting for wind shifts and turbulence. Each movement was precise, deliberate, and essential. The runway grew larger in the window, the lights clearly marking the safe zone ahead. The plane touched down, wheels meeting tarmac with a controlled, steady impact. The young woman maintained her focus, guiding the plane along the runway, slowing gradually and keeping it straight. She applied brakes carefully, balancing them with throttle and rudder adjustments. The plane's shuddering ceased, the engines throttled down, and the aircraft came to a complete stop. Relief washed over her, but she remained attentive until the plane fully slowed and came to rest safely. Passengers erupted in emotion. Some cried tears of relief, others hugged loved ones tightly, and some whispered heartfelt thanks. Into the air. Flight attendants moved quickly to reassure everyone, offering calm instructions and helping passengers unbuckle and prepare to exit. The young woman, still in the cockpit, felt an overwhelming mixture of exhaustion, relief, and pride. She had faced the impossible and succeeded. The pilot, now fully recovered, approached her with gratitude and respect, shaking her hand and thanking her for her extraordinary courage. Emergency crews arrived, ready for any complications, but none occurred. The plane had landed safely without major injuries. Passengers began to disembark, some looking back at the cockpit window, trying to see the young woman who had saved their lives. News cameras and reporters had arrived, eager to cover the miraculous landing, and passengers shared their stories, praising the bravery and calm of the person who had guided them to safety. The young woman stepped out of the cockpit, feeling the weight of what she had accomplished. She had taken control in an unimaginable situation, stabilizing a failing plane and landing it safely. Her courage, focus, and determination had saved dozens of lives. The pilot and co-pilot, once the sole operators, now acknowledged that she had achieved what they could not under the circumstances. She had turned fear into action and improbability into reality. News of her heroism spread quickly. People were amazed that an untrained civilian could take control of a plane in crisis and guide it safely to the ground. The young woman became a symbol of bravery, quick thinking, and resilience. Interviews were conducted, stories shared, and she received messages of admiration from all over the world. Yet despite the attention, she remained humble, quietly explaining that she had only done what she felt necessary to save lives. As the airport cleared, the young woman reflected on the day's events. She thought of every passenger, every crew member, and the incredible responsibility she had shouldered. The fear, tension, and exhaustion had been overwhelming, but her focus and determination had carried her through. She realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. She had done what seemed impossible, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. She walked away from the plane, forever changed by the experience. The world knew her as a hero, but to her it was a moment that revealed the power of calm observation, learned knowledge, and instinctive action. She had discovered her own strength, the ability to rise to an unimaginable challenge and guide others safely through it. The passengers had survived, the crew had witnessed extraordinary bravery, and she had become a living example of what humans are capable of when courage and determination meet necessity. The story of that flight remained in the hearts of those who had been on board, a tale of hope, courage, and the triumph of the human spirit. The young woman returned to her life, forever aware of the extraordinary event she had been part of. She had faced the impossible, acted decisively, and succeeded. She had done more than anyone had expected, and in doing so, she had shown that even in moments of extreme fear and danger, one person could make all the difference. Her legacy was not just survival, but the demonstration of courage, composure, and the power to achieve the impossible.